Good morning, everybody. Slide, don't pay attention to the title. So I'm John Nelson. I work at Carbon Black. I'm a sales engineer there, but I come from kind of a more non-traditional background in this space. I've only been sales engineer for about 6 years. I retired from the Pennsylvania State Police as a corporal. I had done computer crime investigations for them for over 13 years. And then I went and taught for the government. So more of a practitioner than a sales engineer, but this is like my working retirement, light lifting, and I work with cool people. So my OS query experience is really only stemmed from the fact that we incorporated it into one of our products. I'd never been exposed to it before that, but since I have been exposed to it, it is like a virus, and I love it. It's just amazing. And I'm one of our biggest advocates for it at Carbon Black. So I don't know if any of you guys went to the happy hour last night, but I certainly did. Free drinks are always a good thing. And then we went out after that. So I did get some sleep last night, but my severity score might slightly affect my presentation. So what I want to talk about today, and the reason why I kind of told you to ignore that initial slide, was because I was given that topic, but I kind of pivoted. So what I want to really focus on is looking at queries, and when you are first exposed to a problem and you're like, okay, how do I solve this thing? So look at disabled services. So when we're looking at that, you may go out and try to Google and find out if somebody else has written the exact query that you need, or you're probably just going to go start banging it out yourself, because there aren't a whole lot of great repositories to pull that stuff from. And then you're creating these queries, and they may or may not work for multiple different security frameworks or compliance frameworks. And then you also have to worry about different operating systems as well. So when you're looking at all the vast amount of data attributes that you can query against, this is, and Tanya kind of touched on this yesterday, a lot of our customers and even our own internal people are kind of like that guy that was supposed to go out and buy things for dinner. Well, he stopped by the dispensary before he went to the grocery store, and then he gets to the grocery store and he buys chocolate milk, Doritos, and about 13 Interman's Danishes, and then comes back to the house and they're like, dude, you're supposed to cook dinner. And so they have this they just have so many options, and the things that they are pulling back aren't necessarily helping them. So we're trying to empower them in a way that they can really make better sense of this. And when people are creating these queries inside your own organizations, you have different people using it, different business units using it and creating all these queries, and they're doing it in silos. We've seen a lot of them be very insular, and they're not passing this information around. And you create a security-related query that could very easily fit into these other two silos. So we're really looking at a way to encourage sharing of these queries and an easier mechanism for doing this. So really what we're advocating is, let's stop reinventing the wheel every time we're looking at solving a problem with OS query. So what I'm proposing is a query matrix. Everybody here, or anybody not familiar with the attack framework? Good. So that's what I'm proposing that we steal from. We create a OS query matrix based upon this same framework. So when we're looking at creating queries, and this is something that we started doing at Carbon Black, is looking across all these different security and compliance frameworks to come up with a set of queries and be able to put them into this matrix so that you can quickly go in, look based upon a use case to quickly navigate and find queries that will solve your use case based upon the regulations that you're looking to be compliant against, the security use case, operating system. So that's the basis for this. So I kind of went through and looked at all these frameworks and started pulling out common themes within it. And I took all these things and kind of went back and forth with some people, and we looked at some of the query requirements and how we should build this thing out. So I've seen a lot of things, especially within Carbon Black itself, but some of our customers do this as well, is they'll create a query that brings back a whole lot of data. And it's not really answering a question at that point. You have to do further analysis on that, especially when you're like looking for something that's like, is it vulnerable to this thing? Or is this thing disabled? And you're not really answering that question with the query. You're getting data back, and then you have to make a decision based upon that data, and you have to go through and interpret it. So we're looking for really queries that are pulling back that answer. We wanted a mechanism for tagging all these queries so that you would be able to go through and search them much more efficiently and effectively. Obviously, we need to identify the operating system for these different queries. We want a very good description. Tanya kind of touched on that before. Like, if the title of your query is the description of your query, that's bad mojo. And then we, of course, want to tie it to the different frameworks and regulations. So let's dive into some examples of what we're looking at here. This is a very, very rough idea of what we're looking at. These column headers are sub 1.0 ideas of the types of buckets we're going to drop things into. I literally was eating breakfast and just threw those in there because before this they said bucket 1 through 5. So, we were talking about later today, we're having these workshops and stuff. This is something that I would hope people would come and talk to us about, because we would like to flesh this out a lot more and talk about this. But this is, again, going back to the attack framework. We want to go back and use that same idea to put in these queries based upon those aforementioned ideas and constraints. So when we're looking at this framework as well, not only do we want to organize it in this way, but we want to give you a way of filtering on specific regulations, for instance. So like if we chose NIST and we applied a filter, we could go through and show you all the ones that apply to NIST. And then individually, we could show you the regulations that are covered under those specific queries. And the same thing for PCI, doing that same type of thing. But ultimately, pivoting into an individual tile. So now you're getting all that information that we talked about before. You could have a bunch of tags that enable you to go through and search on this data, a good description on it, and then a list of queries that fit into that category. So, in this case, looking at firewalls, so looking at disabled firewalls, whether it's on what operating system it's on, and then dropping in the regulations to show you which ones you're helping to be compliant against, or if it's a specific security use case, like specific TIDs in the attack framework, or any other security use case that would fit into that. So what we're proposing as a way forward for this is we are proposing, one, having not so much a hackathon, but kind of a query-thon, where we get together, we have all these regulations, we're putting them all into a spreadsheet that are all, we can create queries against, and it's a lot of stuff. And so we wanted to first create all the queries for them and start building out all the data so that we could populate the matrix, so that we can build this thing out, and Carbon Black is proposing that we host this in a public fashion. So we would handle the maintenance and somewhat of the design. We're trying to encourage the company to actually hire somebody to maintain this thing, because otherwise it's going to be me and Tanya and the rest of the people at that table there. We all have day jobs. But in Dallas, at the end of this month, so on the 23rd, we're going to have our first query-thon. Initially, this is something I just proposed to my boss and said we should just get together and bust through all these things and drink pizza. And I told you I was hungover. So drink beer, eat pizza. Yeah, that's it. So just sit there and write a bunch of queries. But not just writing the queries, writing the descriptions, adding tags to them, and doing them across all operating systems. So I proposed this to my boss, and he thought it was a great idea. And so we're going to pull in people from Carbon Black to do this, because we have a training session in Dallas at the end of July, because my boss hates me. Why would he take us to Dallas? I live in the Bay Area, by the way. So we're going to be there. Now, we were talking and thinking, like, maybe we should just open this up to the broader community. So if anybody is in Dallas and wants to participate, please come see me, and we will twist my boss's arm to allow outside people to come play with us and drink beer and eat pizza. The other thing is the query exchange. And so this is what Tanya talked about yesterday. There's this really short, nice, easy to remember URL we have here at the bottom. We already have, I think, 2 submissions from outside of our customer base, so people publicly posting queries. So that happened since yesterday, so that's great. But the query exchange is really like a sub 1.0 idea too. That was kind of like us sitting around talking about things, and we're like, the query exchange is great and our customers love it, and maybe we should make this thing public. And then we came to QueryCon, they're like, oh, we made it public. We're like, oh, great. So it does have a lot of queries out there. The organizational structure leaves something a little bit to be desired. And that's where we kind of feel like the matrix is really going to help us organize that better and make it more consumable, both to our customers and the public. So this is definitely something that is in its infancy, and that we are working to build out and make it better. And there are queries in there that need to be tweaked. We're by no means saying this is the end-all be-all, but there is some data in there that is good. So with that said, like I said before, I'd been given a topic. I kind of pivoted from that topic and went down a different rabbit hole. So I'd like to hear from the broader community, what do you guys think about this? Is this something that seems like it's a viable idea? Is it something you guys would be willing to contribute to? Or any other thoughts? Anyone? Sir, yes, sir.
Do you have any plans or thoughts about moving the query exchange to somewhere that isn't hosted by Carbon Black, or at least an easier URL? You can have queryhub.net for $16.
Right, yeah, no, I totally agree with you, because to be quite honest, this morning when I went to try to find the query exchange, no bueno, like couldn't find it. And then once I got the URL, I was just like, seriously? So I agree with you. It needs to be something like that. So when I said hosted by Carbon Black, not necessarily on carbonblack.com, but we want to come up with something to give back to the community. I mean, we're all dealing with an open source project here, and we want to be good participants in this community. Our CTO wrote a table for OS Query already. He's a huge proponent of OS Query in this entire project. So we want to be good community members. So we're not trying to shove our product and our brand down your throat. We're trying to contribute back in a positive way. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
So I see two different ways of doing this. One that you demonstrated today with writing specific queries for specific frameworks. The other one is using those queries to build a really powerful inventory database for your entire fleet, and then using that database to answer those compliance questions, but having those separate. Is there a reason that crafting those queries to answer specific framework questions is the better way to go? Or,
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you are advocating that we create a database of queries.
Yeah, I'm advocating we create a database of facts about our machines.
Okay.
Use those queries to populate the database.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
And then once we have that data, we can answer whatever questions we want without those queries.
Yeah, that might very well be a better way to go. I'd have to think a lot more about that. But from my perspective right now, this is something that at least, see, I'm also thinking about this from the limited resources that we have right here. And so us being able to create and maintain and do all this stuff from that perspective, and that's where the matrix came out of. What you're proposing is above and beyond us, and then that's looked at this broader community. So if we look at going forward that way, then it's definitely something that we would have to pull the broader community into. So it's a great idea. I'd like to talk to you more about it. It's just my little pea head with my 6.42 severity hangover is not fully grasping it right now. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I'm thinking about what Victor just said based on, it sounds like, Victor, like what you were talking about makes sense when you're talking about understanding the configuration of a system so you can see how it matches up against like NIST standards or SIS standards, something like that. I don't know how well that maps for something like attack. Attack is looking for the use of particular behaviors or techniques that are malicious in nature. And that, to me, I've always approached that from an event kind of perspective. Like, hey, this bad event happened. This is evidence of this attack technique. So I don't know. There might be room for both, but maybe attack and NIST can't necessarily be married in the same table. Maybe those are different enough that different approaches are required.
Yeah, I agree with you because, you know, when you're talking about NIST, leave CIS out of it for the time being. I guess it could be in there. But, you know, take those more compliance heavy things. There is a lot of cross-pollination across all that stuff, but I agree with you that attack's kind of over here because this is more looking at like, let's look at essentially the static attributes of this system and where does it currently stand as opposed to attack where it's looking at more dynamic things where attacks are actively happening and how do we detect those going forward. And so these are more anomalies and these are really things that are almost a part of everybody. And it's just a matter of, is this bit flipped or not?
I think that that's actually a very narrow categorization of the attack framework because it also includes a tremendous section on persistence mechanisms, things like
yeah.
cron jobs, daemon launches. How do you do those as a single Boolean query?
Right. I mean, from certain persistence mechanisms, you can do it from a single query. There are a few in there. Granted, there are other ones that are probably outside of that. And I'm not proposing that this query matrix, whether it is in, for attack or any other framework, that this is the end all be all, or that we could create queries for everything in there. I don't think there is, because if you look at tooling outside of Carbon Black, people have just put a big hug around the attack framework. Everybody's embracing that thing right now. And you look at them and they'll map their tool to the framework, and they'll say, okay, our tool can detect these 15 things fully, and these 6 things partially, and these things not at all. And so when I look at attack, there are a lot of things where there are gray areas in there, and it's not, I agree with you, it's not, well, there's not a really binary, where I cover this fully or I don't. There's a lot of gray area in there in the coverage of the attack framework.
I think part of where I'm going with that is some things are very easy to look for and return. Is this malware?
Right.
Some things are much more subtle. Examine all the cron jobs. Are they what you expect?
Yes, right.
The OS query is part of a solution that can do any of these things, but they don't all reduce to these very simple things.
Right.
They do require basically pull some data, analyze it server side.
100%. No, that's what I was getting at with that partial area there, because, you know, in certain areas you can go and find those persistence mechanisms, but when you bring up cron jobs or anything else like that, where, you know, you're like looking for sticky keys or something like that, you know, you get the data back and you have to look at it. I was not advocating that we have to come up with queries that always answer all the questions, because that's impossible. But there are certain cases in things like, is this thing enabled? Is this thing disabled? Those things, we should create queries that answer those questions. There's, you know, other ones where, you know, it's like, okay, if this registry setting is turned on, then that makes this thing vulnerable. So looking at, you know, SMB1, if that's enabled, then you're vulnerable. So, you know, you can easily create queries that come back and say these machines are vulnerable. And from our perspective, you know, Tanya talked about the sophistication of a lot of our users, and they're like, well, I queried all this stuff and it came back, and I don't know what it means. And so, you know, a lot of our really smart people have written queries that go out and they say, okay, I ran this query against this registry key and the data is 1. What does that mean? You and I might know what that means. The guy who constructed the query knows what that means. But the person who goes out and finds that query and copies it and pastes it in and runs it and is like, I don't know what this means. So it's like we should, what I was advocating for was we should, you know, use a case statement that translates that 1 into vulnerable. So it punches them in the face. That's what I was advocating for. Yes, sir.
I actually see a different use case of using the queries. If you can automate them so that you can apply it to the groups of attack techniques in the attack framework. Because you have all these groups that are defined, like, you know, like for example, the oiler. There's certain attributes and elements that you can search for. So if you want to go and say, for example, I want to use OS query to apply the search for everything that could resemble an attack that looks like the oil rig group.
Right.
That will actually utilize this, what you're talking about, but not only will give you a confirmation, you know exactly what you're looking for.
Right.
Right? I think there's a big use case there, because right now today, they do list attack techniques, but there's no way for like you have to build them yourself. And I think OS query can actually be the Swiss Army knife that can allow you to perform like your ER searches and everything else.
Right.
Down to the registry and the processes, the IP addresses and everything else that goes in.
Yeah, right, yeah, I totally agree with you there. And that,
I think what attack does too, or even any framework, it gives you some more context around why you're doing something, but you could take it a step further, like you're saying, and look at like the APIs to start saying, if I see certain triggers, can I automatically run certain queries, because now I have context around certain attributes that I'm looking for, because it could even take it more to an automated stance as well, which I think would be interesting.
yeah, but going back to your point, also, it's like, that's where the tagging comes into play. So like, you know, at least I was envisioning, you know, having these different verticals to drop things into. But what you're kind of talking about is it's more like, how do we draw that? As if we've dropped everything in these different verticals, but for the oil rig, it could come from multiple different verticals.
So it's like an attack symptoms, like if somebody's getting sick, you go to the doctor, he's
Right.
like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
He's gonna look at the symptoms that you have.
Right.
So like, could be multiple malware
Mhm.
remnants, there could be multiple registry keys, there could be a bunch of IP addresses. All alone, it doesn't work, but when you apply the pattern and the analytics.
Right.
That gives you
Yeah.
that visibility.
Right, and so I think that's where, you know, and for the people who are applying those techniques, and this goes back to the idea that we had these siloed queries and these disparate queries. We don't have a clearinghouse where all this stuff is together. So what you're proposing is so much harder, because you, as the analyst, have to see all these threads and then go, oh, I think this is indicative of oil rig. Let me go verify that. Oh yeah, it is. So in having the query matrix, and you are putting in queries, or you go to the matrix and you're like, is there a query for this already? Boop, 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 yep, it's there. Let me add a tag about oil rig to this, because it's not there. And so you can go through and look at all the existing queries in the matrix. When you see attacks like that, you could go find all the different queries that meet those attributes and add a new tag to that, so that now you could go query oil rig, pull everything back, or as you are going and finding queries to look for something, you can look in the tags and say, oh, what's this oil rig thing? Yeah. So, yeah, great stuff. Anyone else? Yes, sir. I like the color of your shirt.
Is this going to be open for like community submissions once it becomes
Oh,
matrix?
100%.
And is there going to be any kind of review process? So
Yes.
everyone claims that this is going to certify against some question.
Yes. So, just like the query exchange right now, so if you haven't actually gone out and looked at it, shut that slide off. But essentially what happens is, it's not like a wiki where you're just throwing up a query and boom, it's there, and no one's gonna go take a look at it. So right now at the query exchange, if you put a query into it, Carbon Black people go back and look at it, run them, ensure that this is actually pulling back the data that it claims that it's gonna pull back, that it's syntactically correct, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we are doing that, but as this thing hopefully takes off and becomes an actual entity, I kind of envision that probably being broadened to the larger community. And so we would probably have admins that will assist us in vetting the queries. And, you know, we'll probably add some sort of voting system in there as well to talk about the efficacy of these queries. So, you know, we all have different ideas about what makes a good query and what doesn't. So we're not gonna be like the overlord and say like, everything has to be this way. We definitely want community involvement in not only vetting the queries, but making them more efficient and effective. Yeah. Anything else? Nope, okay, great, thank you guys. Oh, look at that, 19 seconds.